This is Bloomberg Businessweek Daily, reporting from the magazine that helps global leaders stay ahead, with insight on the people, companies, and trends shaping today's complex economy, plus global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Businessweek Daily with Carol Massar and Tim Stenovec, live on Bloomberg Radio, television, YouTube, and Bloomberg Originals.
Yes, indeed, everybody. Monday off and running. A very good afternoon, though. I'm Carol Massar along with Tim Stenovec, live here on Bloomberg Businessweek Daily. I mean, we've got a day that you would have no idea about what happened over the weekend in terms of the U.S. and Venezuela, because right now we have a major risk on trade.
Yeah, the S&P 500 up 0.8%, as is the NASDAQ Composite. The Dow surging 1.7%. We're going to have more from Charlie Pellet in just a minute, but investors, traders, they're kind of shrugging off any concerns about geopolitics.
Dow at a record, folks. Maybe you don't like that index, but it's at a record. You've got most of the Mag 7 higher today as a whole. They're up about 1%. Energy, financials, consumer discretionary, all up more than 2%. Energy names up about 3%. And I got to say, Tim, that is a big focus for us in the next 60 minutes.
Yeah, you mentioned the Dow. I mean, if you look at energy stocks in the Dow, up 5.6%, the best performer there. We're talking geopolitics, Carol. We're asking the questions. Why Venezuela? What's the real goal of the U.S.? Is it all about oil or power? Or is it about both?
Or something else, right? We just keep thinking what's going on. We're going to talk with the director of Maritime Studies program over at Tufts University's Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy on the day after challenge. Those are his words, meaning the day after the challenge when the U.S., of course, went into Venezuela. So we're going to see what he has to say. We're also going to take a little bit more of a look into the markets. Chinese debt, oil stocks rallying, oil, the commodity, and gold higher. U.S. Treasury yields are lower. Markets reacting, as Tim mentioned, but they're not coming undone. So we're going to talk to Mike Collins, Managing Director and Executive Portfolio Advisor for Fixed Income at PGIM. And then we've got a lot of great players here at Bloomberg and others that are going to kind of piece together the story of what happened over the weekend.
One of those great players standing by now is Charlie Pellet. He's got the latest on the trade. He's standing by. Hey there, Charlie.
Hi, thank you very much. Nice setup because we have got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all ripping higher. First full trading week of the new year. Back to work Monday. The Dow right now at a record 49,206. It is surging 823 points for the Dow, a gain of 1.7%. Keeping it all in context, S&P 500 index up 54, off-session highs 69.12. That is a gain of about 0.8%. NASDAQ Composite index up 176 now. For NASDAQ, a gain of 1.8%. The Bloomberg Mag 7 index up 1.1%. The Russell 2000 index up by 1.8%. The 10-year 4.15%. And the 2-year 3.44%. Gold is surging $116 the ounce, $44.48. It is up now by 2.7%. Silver at $76.36 the ounce, up almost 5%. And Bitcoin now up 3.4%, back above 94,376 on a Bitcoin. Right now, Chevron shares are surging 5.7%, up by $8.84 among some of the other oil majors today. ExxonMobil up 2.2%. Also looking at ConocoPhillips up 3.5%. Among some of the oil services stocks today, Halliburton up 10.8%. SLB up by 11.8%. And Baker Hughes up now by 5.8%. We'll have a whole lot more on energy coming up in just a moment right here on Bloomberg Businessweek Daily. So again, recapping here, stocks pushing higher. S&P up 53 now, up about 0.8%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And I was kind of blown away when Charlie showed what gold is doing right now, and that's after gaining almost 65% last year. Remember our guest that we had was it on Friday? Or just saying that everybody should have like 2-3% of their portfolio in gold right now.
And he also mentioned Bitcoin, too. 1% in Bitcoin.
Gold, Bitcoin. All right.
That's not what we're talking about, though.
No, we're going to talk a little bit about the energy names because they're definitely fast and furious today. Valero, the company formerly known also as Schlumberger. We're talking about SLB, Halliburton, Chevron, ExxonMobil. U.S. oil stocks jumping overall today. That's after President Trump pledged to revive the Venezuelan energy sector following the capture of Nicolas Nicolas Maduro over the weekend. We wanted to get more into the energy infrastructure and oil sector. We welcome Devika, Krishna, Kumar. She is Bloomberg News Oil Trading America's team leader. So good to have you here with us. And we've got still so many questions, even though we've been talking about this nonstop for 48 or 72 hours here. What's the reality about the oil potential in Venezuela?
Yeah, over the last 2 days, we've heard so much about the reserves that Venezuela has and the riches under the ground. But I think the big test will be how can the riches below the ground translate to above the ground? And I think President Trump has made it very clear that he wants U.S. oil companies to be at the forefront of the effort to bring Venezuela back to its former glory, doubling production, maybe even getting it back above 3 million barrels a day. The reality of that is going to be way more complicated than a lot of people realize. The state of infrastructure in particular is a big point of concern because you're going to have to repair and restore a lot of infrastructure that has taken a lot of damage over the years, especially the last couple of decades. So whether it's pipelines, infrastructure, even talent, a lot of workers have fled, especially engineers and people who you really need to extract oil out of the ground.
West Texas Intermediate, $58 or so a barrel. Brent crude, $61, $62 a barrel. These aren't exactly high prices that get companies to make big CapEx investments.
Yeah.
What does that mean? Does that mean that companies are less likely to spend this money?
Well, yeah, it also means who's going to buy this oil? Really, it's about whether, even if we can get Venezuelan oil back up and running, or even extract, let's say, 500,000 barrels a day more with existing infrastructure and existing expertise, it's going to be a challenge to find a buyer in this kind of market. There's a reason prices in 2025 fell by the most since 2020. There's significant oversupply in the market. By some estimates, supply could exceed demand by more than 3 million barrels in this first quarter. If that's the case, the amount of competition for the barrels that are going to come out of Venezuela is going to be significant. Bear in mind, there's a little bit of a difference in the kind of oil that Venezuela produces and the kind of oil that we produce predominantly in the U.S., which, if you really look at the industry terms, it's called a light sweet oil, which means low sulfur, the ones that we produce in the U.S., whereas in Venezuela, it's high sulfur. And the refiners in the Gulf Coast, you mentioned Valero earlier, they are some of the refiners that have the amount of technical expertise that is needed to process this heavy tar-like crude.
Devika, does it make sense from an energy perspective for the United States to target Venezuela?
Oh, yeah. Everything that we've seen so far, really, if you think about it, it's consistent with the Trump administration's messaging, especially around energy dominance. It's really about exerting American energy influence on the world. And I think if you really think about some of the moves that the administration has done over the past year or so, whether it's peace talks in Russia, Ukraine, or Israel and Gaza, and even bombing Iranian facilities. These are things
But I guess my point is, we talk about the U.S. now has overproduction. We could also, Alaska has massive, whether you agree with it or not. So why Venezuela? Why did we have to do this? What about Saudi Arabia? Is there more? I'm just trying to understand why Venezuela. And I thought it was about drugs and not oil. So was it really oil under the guise of drugs? Because Maduro and his wife are being charged with narco-trafficking. So I'm trying to understand, is this really about business interests in the U.S., or what are you hearing from your contacts in the oil world?
Yeah, there's a few moving parts here because, yes, on the surface of it, narco-terrorism is the main charge, and it has been the case since 2020 when Maduro was first indicted here in the U.S., right? And so if you think about it, that's been consistent in terms of messaging about reducing the flow of narcotics into the U.S.
Right.
However, I don't think it's a coincidence that it has the world's largest oil reserves, and President Trump putting the onus on U.S. oil companies, saying we should be the first and we should be positioned in terms of U.S. companies to unlock that production.
And we know he is going to meet with oil executives this week, right? We've already heard that, the messaging coming out.
Right, and there's a conference this week in Miami, the Goldman Sachs Energy Conference, where Chris Wright is going to meet with some of these producers. We don't know for sure how the conversations evolved prior to this event, because, you could have had perhaps more engaging conversations from the industry before doing this, but it seems like the administration's kind of starting to do this now after the fact rather than before.
How does it work in a country such as Venezuela, or how will it work let's say an American company makes a big investment, extracts the oil, sells it, ships it. How does Venezuela benefit from that?
Well, it's still a nationalized energy industry in Venezuela. PDVSA controls most of the production and most of what happens with that oil. Now, Chevron has been operating in Venezuela. It's one of the only big oil producers still left in the country after several rounds of
it produces about 20% of the country's oil under a sanctions waiver. It ships the crude to U.S. refineries.
Right. And that OFAC license and the waiver is going to be something key to watch over the coming days. So that will affect whether somebody like an Exxon or ConocoPhillips may want to re-enter Venezuela. But bear in mind, these guys also have some baggage when it comes to Venezuela, because if your assets have been appropriated and they're owned billions of dollars from when they used to operate in the country before, you can understand why there's a little bit of skepticism, and they are really seeking assurances and clarity on how their operations will really work on the ground. Because like you said, it's one thing to extract the oil from the ground, it's completely another to transport it safely, load it safely, put it onto ships that can actually leave the waters. So all of these pieces are still moving targets.
And having the guarantees of a favorable U.S. government or U.S. business interest government going forward. Devika, thank you so much. Devika Krishna Kumar, Bloomberg News Oil Trading America's team leader. On that, we did have a headline cross the Bloomberg. Venezuela's Delcy Rodriguez, who was interim president, now sworn in as acting president of Venezuela. So we continue to get developments certainly out of that country. All right, we want to continue on the oil story.
Yeah, and U.S. energy goals when it comes to Venezuela, as we mentioned, realizing President Donald Trump's plan for a U.S.-led revival of Venezuela's beleaguered oil industry could be a years-long and challenging process, costing upwards, Carol, of $100 billion.
Yeah, we want to welcome in a scholar on the politics and economics of energy and resource policy in Latin America specifically. He is Francisco Monaldi, a fellow in Latin American energy policy and director of the Latin American Energy Program at the Center for Energy Studies at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. He's really so much more. I highly recommend you Google him, because when it comes to energy economics, energy management, this is someone who has consulted governments around the world, including Venezuela, the U.S., Saudi Arabia, and a bunch of companies as well, including Chevron and ExxonMobil. Dr. Monaldi, great to have you here with Tim and myself. Is this about a U.S. oil and energy grab, first of all, in your view? Does it make sense that the United States wants to make sure that those energy assets are up and running, or do you see it as something else?
Well, I think it's a combination of things. It's one of the motivations. I mean, without a doubt, having more production in the Western Hemisphere is something that contributes to the energy security of the United States and potentially of the world. And today we have a surplus of oil. So it's not about the short term as much as about the future, in which the role that Venezuela could play could be really important to supply the still increasing oil demand in the world.
What does that future look like? I mean, help us take this out 1, 5, 10 years from now. What does the demand curve look like, and how does Venezuela fit into that?
Well, if you look at the scenarios like the recent one by the International Energy Agency or the Energy Information Administration, basically there is a high probability that we will not see in the next 10 years decline of oil demand. And in those scenarios, we actually face the potential of oil scarcity by the end of this decade. And there are very few countries, perhaps Iran, other than Venezuela, that can increase significantly production in the next decade. Venezuela could multiply by 4 or even 5 its production. At least that's technically possible. Politically is, of course, another question.
Well, and I also do wonder, is some of this because of AI? We constantly talk about the power grab, the energy drawdown, the energy demand versus supply because of all of the investments in AI. Is that part of it? And this is the national security play, if you will, by the United States?
Well, the case of AI is more about natural gas than it is about oil, because oil is typically not used to produce electricity. But without a doubt, the fact that for the first time in a long time, we will see a significant increase in electricity demand in the United States will have effects over the whole energy system and does contribute to the need of more fossil fuels.
So I'm wondering about companies and making big investments in Venezuela moving forward. Our reporting at Bloomberg News says that ConocoPhillips is owed more than $8 billion by Venezuela. Exxon is still owed about $1 billion stemming from the nationalization of assets. International arbitrators have ruled. What do these companies need to see from Venezuelan leadership or from U.S. leadership to say, I'm ready to go back in there and make significant tens of billions of dollar investments?
Yes, there are lots of preconditions for them to be willing to do that. In the case of Conoco, because of the size of what they're owed, it is likely that they will be interested in going back to the country, because otherwise it would be hard for them to recover that debt. But they will need, first of all, they don't at this point have even contracts. They don't have any particular fields. Those fields were expropriated from them. And they will need to have a clear regulatory, contractual, fiscal framework that is credible in the long run, and it does make sense for them to, sink billions of dollars in investment before they can recover it. In the case of Exxon, it might be something they will be even more cautious, because they are not owed that much money, and of course they have a history of government reneging and difficulty operating in the country that they will not forget.
How much of this also has to do with China, who has certainly, been investing in South America for some time, and we know that, and has a relationship with Venezuela as well? How much of it has to do with that?
Well, it's interesting. The remaining big players in Venezuela, about half of the production is done by the national company, 25% by Chevron. And then the other two big players are the Chinese and the Russian national oil companies. Each produces about 10, 11% of Venezuela's oil production. In the case of the Chinese, they have been very hesitant in the last decade or so to invest more, because they have had a tough experience in Venezuela. They are still owed upwards of $10 billion. And in the case of the Russians, they have a lot of reserves in Venezuela under their contracts, but they have not developed them. And of course, under the current circumstances, are very unlikely to develop it in the future.
Francisco, I want to ask you, it's a charged question, and it's not a simple one to answer. We have a couple minutes left here. Was this a good idea by the United States, and what you're seeing play out now? Was it a good idea for the oil industry, a good idea for national security?
Well, it depends a lot on what happens from now moving forward. I mean, if this has a happy ending with a transition to democracy, rule of law, etc., I think it would be something very positive for the region and for the future of the oil market. If it doesn't, of course, it could go really, really wrong. And of course, we'll have to see.
All right, going to leave it there. I'm sure we'll be reaching out to you again. Dr. Francisco Monaldi, fellow in Latin American Energy Policy, director of the Latin American Energy Program at the Center for Energy Studies over at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. Hey, coming up next, we continue on what's going on, of course, in Venezuela, what happened over the weekend. And as we look into the outlook, we're going to get into the New World Order, courtesy of President Trump's ousting of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. There's a lot going on. We've got it covered as we head to a break. Take a look at some of the names in the energy patch. As we mentioned, we are seeing moves to the upside. Chevron up almost 6%. Other names, ExxonMobil up about 2.4%. The rally continues, as we do on this Monday. Carol Massar, Tim Stenovec. This is Bloomberg.
It's 2:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We do have the Dow Jones Industrial Average trading at a record up 795 points right now. That is a gain of 1.6%. Demand for tech shares remains strong even while the ouster of Venezuela's president, Nicolas Maduro, fans worries over geopolitical risk. The S&P at 6909, off session highs up 50, a gain there of 0.7%. The Nasdaq Composite Index up 0.7. The Nasdaq 100 Index up 0.8%, and the Russell 2000 Index of small cap shares advancing now by 1.8%. The Bloomberg Mag 7 Index up 1.1%, the 10-year 4.15%, with the 2-year 3.45%. Gold is up $108 the ounce at $44.40, up 2.5%. Silver is also surging up 4.4%, $76.03 the ounce. And crude, the major story today, West Texas Intermediate crude up 1.6%, $58.26 a barrel. Chevron right now up by 5.7%. Bitcoin also surging up 3.4%, 94,349 now on Bitcoin. U.S. airlines are rebuilding their Caribbean operations after the U.S. military incursion over the weekend into Venezuela triggered airspace closures across the region, stranding thousands of passengers trying to return home from winter vacations. Right now, we do have shares of American Airlines. They are gaining 3.5%. Delta Airlines up by 5.4%. So again, recapping here, S&P up 50, off session highs 69.08 on the S&P, a gain right now of 0.7%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. Carol Massar along with Tim Stenovec live here on Bloomberg Businessweek Daily. Well, the U.S. raid that captured Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro put America's allies and adversaries definitely on notice. President Trump has a new world order, Tim, of his own. At least that's how it's been reporting out.
Yeah, in the aftermath of the stunning late-night operation that saw Maduro and his wife whisked from a guarded military base near Caracas to a New York jail, President Trump demonstrated just how far the U.S. is willing to go to eliminate a leader seen as a threat to American interests and security. So we're looking at the challenges that come next. Those are the ones that are presented by the U.S. raid on Venezuela. We welcome Rockford Weitz, Professor of Practice and Director of the Maritime Studies Program at Tufts University's Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. He joins us from Tucson, Arizona. Professor, good to have you on the program. What do you believe is the true motivation of the U.S. when it comes to Venezuela?
Great question. So sorry for the background noise. I'm at the airport. What we're looking at here is this is a geopolitical competition between the United States and China and Russia over who is the main ally of Venezuela in the Caribbean.
Wow. Okay, so before what we saw late Friday and early Saturday, what would you have said is the true ally? Who would you have said is the true ally? And then now after, how does the U.S. become the true ally?
Okay. All right. So great question. I love these questions. So before, it was a combination of China was their geo-economic ally, helping them with infrastructure. Russia was a military ally with basing rights there and supporting their military. And even Iran, even though it's not a great power, was helping Venezuela. So that was their sort of cast of characters, as well as Cuba. Cuba's frankly a little bit more reliant on Venezuela than vice versa. Everything has changed since Saturday morning in the sense that there's obviously new leadership in Venezuela, a transition leadership. It's unclear who will be in charge in the long run, but it's very clear that the great power that's going to have the most influence over Venezuela is now the United States.
What I'm wondering, Professor Weitz, what's the international precedent for doing something like this? I mean, how should we read what is essentially a kidnapping of a leader of a foreign country and his wife, removal of that leader from said country? What's it akin to in our past history, our recent past history? And to be fair, it's not the first time the U.S. or others have removed a global leader or worked behind the scenes to support U.S.-friendly groups, leaders in foreign countries. So we get that. We're not all naive, but I'm just curious, are we setting up for kind of a leader grab around the world among countries and among global powers?
Another great question. Thank you. So let me try to answer it using history. So it was actually, ironically, 36 years ago to the day that the United States took Noriega from Panama. And that's the closest parallel. So he also was charged with narco trafficking. He was also then taken to the United States for prosecution. They also justified it in exactly the same way. There was an indictment against him in the United States, so that covered the domestic law piece. And then under the UN Charter, countries are allowed self-defense and also self-defense of their population. So it was framed, this was back in 1990 under Bush Sr., as Noriega is a narco trafficker and therefore must be taken care of to protect the American people from the drug trade. That is allowed under the UN Charter as self-defense. So that covers you under international law. Again, every legal issue is gray. So people will say it's against international law, but you can make a case that it's consistent with international law and the UN Charter. You can make a case that it's consistent with domestic law. And I would say it does set a precedent that other narco trafficking leaders around the world could be taken, not just by the United States, but by others. But this doesn't really apply to Taiwan. I've spent a lot of time in Taiwan, and narco trafficking is not their game. And so I think that the precedent can be narrowed, but it doesn't. It also means that other large countries, other great powers like China and Russia will look at this to see how they can use it to their advantage.
Well, you mentioned Taiwan, but what about Russia, and what about Vladimir Putin in Russia? Could he use this as justification for doing something to Zelensky?
So Putin will try to come up with any justification to go after Zelensky, but Zelensky clearly is not a narco trafficker. I don't think anyone's saying that. So we can argue not. The other thing is Zelensky has very powerful friends right next door. The NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, Poland borders Ukraine. The U.S., although Trump, has not supported as much as maybe previous presidents have, we're behind Zelensky. Zelensky's got powerful friends. Venezuela really didn't have powerful friends in this part of the world. China has a very strong navy around Taiwan, for example. They don't have a major naval presence in the Caribbean. Russia as well. It is a naval power. It's not nearly as strong as either China or the United States, but it doesn't have a major Caribbean presence. So what's fundamentally happened is in the Americas, the U.S. is the major great power with the major military. And I will just note this because it is important for the bigger conversation. The Trump administration did issue its national security strategy just last month. It said we're going to focus more attention on the Americas, and it was consistent with this operation in Venezuela, though I will admit I was surprised at how much force was used to take Maduro and his wife, 150 aircraft. I mean, this was a major operation on Saturday.
Wow, so many different places to go. Well, having said that, listening to a lot of the coverage here on Bloomberg, Professor Weitz, it sounds also like that the U.S. intelligence has been on the ground for some time. We're going to talk about this a little bit later on our broadcast, but that they had help in kind of pulling this together. Is that a bad assumption or read into the U.S. getting an assist from other leaders in Venezuela?
I think it's an accurate read. I've been following this basically night and day since Saturday. A lot of coffee. But basically what has happened is it's not surprising. The United States has been focused on Maduro and his regime. Really, it's been bipartisan. Biden also had a bounty out for Maduro to be removed. So Maduro is not popular internationally. He's not popular domestically. He's essentially clinging on to power. I thought one of the most interesting thing was that almost his entire security staff were Cubans. This has come out from multiple sources. So it's not surprising that the United States would spend a couple months gathering intelligence. I have to say that this was almost perfectly executed from a special operations perspective. Yeah. They had one mission, seize Maduro and his wife, take them to the United States, at the same time, essentially take out the Venezuelan military. So the Venezuelan Navy essentially no longer exists. Same for the Air Force, no more radar. Any tanks they had are probably gone. So this was executed very well. And of course, intelligence was involved. So, and Trump even said that publicly. CIA is already there. So I would say public sources have verified it. Multiple sources, I think it's probably accurate to say that's correct.
Well, that's one part of the mission, and that was certainly this mission. But I think many critics out there and even observers saying, now comes the hard part. The potential power vacuum. And we've seen what quote unquote nation building for the United States has looked like in the past. How does that play out? What is the right way for the U.S. to do that?
This is literally what I think is the most important question for today. So I call this the day after challenge. This is a big deal. It's going to be very difficult to smoothly create a transition to a new government in a peaceful way without triggering an insurgency. The Venezuelan military wasn't really strong before Saturday. They're really not strong now. That being said, similar to Vietnam, similar to Colombia, I used to live in Colombia. I know the country well. I've been to Venezuela as well as a tourist in the 90s. There's parts of Venezuela that are the perfect guerrilla warfare area. The United States has, I think, no interest in a long-term occupation of Venezuela because it would not be pretty, and it would look similar to some of our misadventures in the Middle East. I think the model to look at is Panama. You have in Venezuela a recognized opposition. You have Maria Corina Machado, who is the recent Nobel Peace Prize winner. You have Edmundo Gonzalez, who is the declared winner, internationally recognized, of the last presidential election. They're friends. They're a good opposition. I think what can happen is that they can be brought into this process and that the U.S. can help them establish some level of control. Probably involves a few hundred, maybe a few thousand elite American troops guarding, say, the presidential palace in Caracas and essentially having a presence at all the major military bases, certainly around Caracas. And then eventually that gets transitioned over to the new government. It's going to be hard. Essentially, Venezuela has had a dysfunctional government since 1999. Maduro was in power for over 10 years as a dictator. All of his allies are in the National Assembly. They're in the government. They're in the military. There's narco traffickers who are well armed. So it's not going to be easy, but I do think it's possible. I also think it's very different from Iraq or Afghanistan because there's no religious element here. Venezuelans, not only are they all Christian, they're all Catholic. So that's not a piece of it. Doesn't mean it's easy. I think it's going to take a lot of bandwidth to do it well. I'm not sure the Trump administration is ready to do it, but we will see. We will see.
Yeah, we'll certainly be covering this story, I would say, for probably days and weeks to come. So appreciate it. Rockford Weitz, he's professor of practice and director of the Maritime Studies program at Tufts University's Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. When we come back, a market read on the U.S. moves and perhaps the power grab in Venezuela, something we just talked about as we head to a break. Take a look at WTI crude up about 1.7%.
It's 2:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ. They're all advancing right now. Off session highs. The S&P currently standing at 69.04 with a gain of 45 points, up by about 0.7%. Investors, though, snapping up tech shares, even while the ouster of Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro fans worries over geopolitical risk. The Dow now up 726, up by 1.5%. NASDAQ is up 131 for NASDAQ, a gain of 0.6%. The NASDAQ 100 index up by 0.7%. The Russell 2000 index of small cap shares up now by 1.8%. 10-year currently yielding 4.16% with a 2-year 3.45%. Gold now up $112 the ounce at $44.44. That is a gain of 2.6%. Silver up 4.7%, $76.24 the ounce. And West Texas Intermediate crude oil up 1.8%, $58.36 a barrel. Brent up 1.7%, barrel of Brent. The global benchmark at 61.79. And Bitcoin right now up 3.3%, 94,222 on Bitcoin. Amazon shares are advancing now. We've got Amazon up by almost 3%. Amazon, by the way, unveiling a TV designed to resemble a piece of framed art, making it the latest TV maker to emulate a sleek design popularized by Samsung Electronics. Right now, Amazon up by 2.7%. So again, recapping the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, they're all higher. S&P up by about 0.6%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, got it, Charlie. Thank you so much. Carol Massar, along with Tim Stenovec, live here at Bloomberg Businessweek Daily. Money managers, they've been loading up on Venezuelan debt. This is one of the stories that we've been reporting out here at Bloomberg. This has been happening in the past few months as President Trump ramped up pressure on President Maduro, with some investors seeing the potential for a restructuring as early as this year. And then, of course, Tim, then we had the weekend happen.
So with more on that, let's head to Sarasota, Florida, and to Mike Collins, Managing Director and Executive Portfolio Advisor on the multi-sector team over at PGIM. PGIM Fixed Income, approximately $1.5 trillion in total assets under management. For PGIM Fixed Income, it's more than $1 billion. Mike, big picture, how big of a deal is it what happened in Venezuela, especially when it comes to the global market and investing landscape? How are you looking at it?
Yeah, Tim and Carol, happy New Year. Great to be here. You know, I get these questions all the time whenever you have these geopolitical flare-ups around the world, whether they're in Asia, the Middle East, or Latin America. And my answer is always the same. You know, kind of fade the headlines is generally the knee-jerk instinct that you should have as an investor. You should really focus on the fundamentals of the global economy, the fundamentals of the U.S. economy, where growth is going to be, where inflation is going to be. Obviously, commodity prices are in the headlines today with the Venezuela thing. But remember, Venezuela is producing now less than 1% of global oil. Remember, 60 years ago, back when I was born, they were producing 15% of the world's oil. And now they're less than 1%, right? So they have taken a huge fall from grace. They do not have a big impact economically on the global stage. 60 years ago, believe it or not, Venezuela was in the top quartile of all countries in terms of GDP per capita. Today, they are at the bottom of the list, right? And you think of other countries where they've been geopolitical flare-ups. Typically, these countries don't have huge international economic implications. So that's why the markets are just kind of, you know, whistling past the graveyard here and just ignoring the geopolitical risk. That is the standard playbook.
And Michael, just forgive me. I want to go back. More than $1 trillion over at PGIM Fixed Income under management. I misspoke earlier. Okay, so if that's why we're seeing sort of the relative calm today, let's then focus on kind of what comes next and the political and potential implications for that, because I think that is a big question that investors have right now. I mean, certainly people don't want to see some prolonged and, you know, dare I say, boots on the ground mission in the country. But I think that, I mean, me going into this week, that was a big concern that I thought investors would have. What if this actually turns into something akin to like we've seen with past quote unquote nation building activities from the U.S.?
We've spent most of the weekend and a lot of this morning doing deep dives into the situation in Venezuela. I mean, I'm fortunate to work on this gigantic team where we have, you know, geopolitical analysts. We have really deep economic analytical resources. We have people who've been in the military. So we have a lot of great color just from our own team and our contacts. And there's really two scenarios, right? One, Tim, is the one you pointed out, that things do get ugly, that Venezuela kind of gets worse, conditions get worse, that the U.S. tries to do a more aggressive takeover and it gets really messy, a la some of the situations in the Middle East that your last guest was talking about. But there's also this upside scenario, right? And I think it kind of confirms the fact that we're moving into this, you know, G3-ish type of world. And the U.S. is certainly trying to take the lead there and showing that, hey, we have control of the Americas here, which could result in better outcomes for countries like Venezuela, could result in better outcomes for the U.S., could result in better outcomes for other Latin American countries, right? And I think that's what the markets are focusing on. I mean, we're looking at all the emerging market debt quotes and runs out there right now, and generally the bonds are trading better, right? And I think they're looking at this as potentially the upside scenario, not the downside. But you're absolutely right. I mean, we really have to keep our radar attentive to those potential downside risks.
Yeah, Mike, on that point, a raft of investment firms eyeing opportunities in Venezuela after that U.S. strike. Tribeca Investment Partners is sending a team to Caracas this week to inspect potential assets, calling it a gold rush. Have you guys changed any of your investment theses when it comes to Venezuela at this point, or not yet?
Well, remember, they've been pretty heavily sanctioned in terms of trading and also trading some of their securities. So good news is for people who have a huge emerging market debt team and big investments around the world in emerging market debt, this could potentially free up trading opportunities and relative value opportunities. I mean, again, these bonds, some of their bonds have, doubled or tripled over the last few weeks. So they're still trading at really distressed levels, right? We're talking, 20, 30 cents on the dollar. But, there are opportunities for sure. There are going to be a lot of relative opportunities. We're looking at even places like Colombia today we're talking about, where their local interest rates are really high and their credit spreads are pretty wide. And so, I think it sets up the world for better relative value trading opportunities. And that's something we're really looking to capitalize on.
So, Mike, if you had to kind of make a bet, I mean, is it 50% that the fortunes and maybe economic and investment outlook for Venezuela are changing for the better at this point? Or is it?
I would say it's a little better than a coin toss, Carol. I would probably put higher odds. Maybe I'm just, talking our book or agreeing with the market's reaction so far. But it certainly feels like, when you're having more private sector resources come into a country that's been totally mismanaged in terms of their natural resources and their politics, there is, I think, a higher likelihood of a better outcome there. But, the road to that better outcome can be really long, and fraught with all kinds of problems.
Right. Lots of bumps can always happen, certainly in a situation like this. Many would agree with that. Hey, Mike, before you go, I'm thinking about the U.S. this week. We do get a jobs report on Friday. We have a bunch of economic news. We did see the U.S. Treasury curve move down today. A little bit of economics news today. What is more important, though, in terms of the U.S. Treasury trade at this point? Is it the U.S. economy, what the Fed does ultimately? Just give us about 30, 40 seconds on that, if you would.
Yeah, again, it's going back to the fundamentals, Carol, right? And if you're looking at U.S. growth, I mean, if anything, expectations for growth this year have ticked up over the last few months. We're entering 2026 with really strong kind of real GDP or consumption and capital expenditure expectations, momentum going into this year. So most forecasts now for U.S. GDP have two handles, right? Whereas not that long ago, they were in the ones. I think the recession risks have moderated in the U.S., and we've taken our probabilities down. And the upside risk to growth, to more productivity from AI, maybe to higher inflation and permanently higher rates has gone up. And that's actually not a great environment for risk assets necessarily, right? So we've been threading this needle. We call it the muddle through scenario, where you kind of run at 2%, you have inflation stuck, between 2 and 3. Right. The Fed eases a couple times. That's a great environment for growth and for inflation and for financial assets. But any of those tails are
we got to run, and I know we'll continue this conversation throughout the year. Mike Collins over at PGIM. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Businessweek Daily with Carol Massar and Tim Stenovec on Bloomberg Radio and Television.
All right, everybody, we're coming up on the last hour of trading. Whew, it's a Monday. Bring out a little bit more coffee. We do have stocks kind of rolling over off their best levels of the session. What does it mean? We still have the S&P up about 43 points, so good for a gain of about 0.6 of a percentage point. Dow, we saw the Dow trading at a record today, just rolling off its best levels, 1.4% to the upside. NASDAQ 100, we are looking at that index up about 0.7%, up 184 points, Tim.
I'm Tim Stenovec along with Carol Massar. Let's take a look at some stocks on the move today. With us is Bloomberg News equities reporter Alexandra Semenova. We got to start with oil stocks.
Yeah, it is all about the oil stocks today. This is after President Donald Trump vowed to revive Venezuela's oil sector. Of course, after the capture of Nicolas Maduro over the weekend. I'm taking a look at Chevron here, really big move on the stock, up about 5%. This is, of course, the only American oil major that is operating in the country under special permissions. And also, of course, ConocoPhillips and ExxonMobil are climbing today. We also got some news that U.S. Energy Secretary Chris Wright plans to talk this week with some of the executives of these companies about their efforts in Venezuela. He will be attending the Goldman Sachs Energy, Clean Tech, and Utilities Conference in Miami. Obviously, the risk of investing in the country is really high, so they're going to have to discuss what that looks like. President Trump has said that it will take billions of dollars to resuscitate the energy sector there, and Secretary of State Marco Rubio said that companies would need certain guarantees and conditions to move forward with this.
Yeah, I would bet, right? I mean, first of all, the energy infrastructure needs a lot of work, right? And then what are the guarantees going forward if you make investments today that it lasts in the longer term? Those things are not inexpensive. All right, so oil stocks definitely on the move. Talk to us about some calls out of Goldman today.
Yeah, it looks like all the analysts across Wall Street are back at their desks, upgrading, downgrading stocks. Over at Goldman, one of the companies that is faring well today is Coinbase. It got a buy rating there. I'm looking at shares up about 9% right now. Analysts there see growth potential from new products like tokenization and prediction markets as well. They also highlight the fact that their subscription service offerings have risen from 5% to 40% of their revenue over the past 5 years. So that could bode well for shares. They also say that the company deserves a higher multiple given the revenue that they've gotten, and also recent underperformance makes it a good entry point. And then on the flip side of that, actually, eToro got downgraded to neutral there. They said that margins are lagging peers due to a more competitive backdrop. So busy day across the Wall Street analyst desks.
I'm just looking at Coinbase down. It's up 14% just this year. So in 2 trading days, that's pretty substantial, but down close to 40% from those highs of last summer.
Yeah, so a ways to go. So hence maybe the undervaluation, if you will.
Exactly.
I've been looking at the chop.
Chip? Are you talking about chips, Carol?
Maybe I'm talking about chops. I am talking about chips. I feel like semiconductors, we've seen a lot of outperformance there. Qualcomm, though, is one name on your list.
Yeah, we can't leave this desk without talking about the AI and chip-related stocks. And Qualcomm today
This is the first time I'm saying AI today. I think for the most...
No, you asked about you said,
energy.
Is it AI?
In the energy
Sorry,
trade.
Carol.
Yeah, but for the most part, usually it's AI everywhere. But go ahead.
And that's probably going to continue for as long as we know. So Qualcomm is extending its push into the market for processors that are the heart of personal computers with its new X2 Plus processor. So it has 2 versions, one with a 10 computer core and one with 6. This apparently includes powerful neural processing units that will make these computers work faster and go longer periods without needing a source of power. Pretty incredible. And we can expect to see a lot of announcements like this at the CES conference this week. It's going to be basically like a chest-puffing conference for the tech companies. So expect those shares to keep moving.
I can't wait to see all the humanoid robots.
Keep looking. You can see them at CES.
I know.
They're not going to be showing up here.
Will they be like badging in here?
Too much technology. We need more human connection these days.
Yeah, I think we're sadly not moving in that direction.
Yeah, investors don't want that.
Yeah. You're like, want to move into a cabin in the woods.
That's me. I just want to uproot my life and go somewhere quiet.
Hate to tell you, I don't think that's going to happen.
Spoken like a New Yorker.
Exactly.
Alex Semenova, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Stocks on the Move. Check out Stocks on the Move, our 5-minute episodes of the biggest winners and losers in the stock market. You can find it on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere you get your podcasts. All right, we're coming up on the last hour of trading. The first full week of trading here in 2026. A lot coming at us, including some economic news, and then earnings season just around the corner.
Yeah, it's hard to believe that that's where we are. We do expect to hear from the big banks very, very soon. Hey, coming up over the next couple of hours on Bloomberg Businessweek Daily, if you're sticking with us on radio, we got a great program.
I am, by the way.
You have to. You have no choice. Our coverage of the extraordinary weekend in Venezuela and the U.S. continues. We're going to Lower Manhattan, where ousted Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro pleaded not guilty to U.S. charges charges of narco-terrorism. And then a lot of questions about what happens next.
Yeah, absolutely. Our Bloomberg Economics geoeconomic analyst for Latin America has some scenarios and thoughts on that. And then our man in Caracas, we're talking about Eric Schatzker, one of the few to interview Maduro at Miraflores Palace. That was back in 2021. So he's going to join us on what the contrast with what they talked about then, and then to see Maduro in downtown New York and Brooklyn. Charges, pleading not guilty. Pretty remarkable.
Meantime, stocks still higher. S&P 500 up 0.6%, as is the NASDAQ Composite. This is Bloomberg Businessweek Daily.